We're here with Mike Barron sharing about comic book writing.
Hey folks, I've been a comic book writer all my life. I've written The Punisher, Flash, Deadman, Star Wars, and my own creations, Nexus and Badger. There are a lot of people who would like to make comics. Comics is the most forgiving medium there is. You can get away with stuff in comics that you couldn't in any other medium. Just look at Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, radioactive black belt hamsters, Flaming Carrot, or Superman himself, who appeared in 1939. It took over a half a century for cinema to be able to convincingly portray what people bought without question when they picked it up off a newsstand for 10 cents 50 years ago. For those of you who want to do comics, let me tell you about my own experience. When I started to write comics, I would draw each page out by hand. Now, I'm not the greatest artist in the world, but I did study art a little bit. And my art is good enough so that the artist and the editors could see at a glance what I wanted on each page. It's worth working on your skills to be able to portray that. I studied anatomy, I studied perspective, I'm no good, but I'm good enough to get my ideas across. Now this may not be for everyone, but it's a very valuable way to do comics because of what it teaches you. It teaches you how much weight a comic page can bear, and by that I mean how many images and how many words, because when you're just working on a sheet of paper, and you're describing everything in words, you can get carried away. I've seen scripts that were so verbose that there was no way they could be turned into a comic, and yet they were. And we've all seen comics like those. One of the most important principles of comics, indeed of storytelling in general, and of life itself, is to show, don't tell. And that means that whatever knowledge regarding the advance of the story you can transmit to the reader visually, without words, you should. A lot of you are TV buffs, and there's no better example of what I'm talking about than the show Better Call Saul, which often begins with a 5-minute wordless sequence with things happening. But they're interesting things, and you follow along, and at the end of the sequence you say, oh, I get it. Now I see where the story is going. What I would do is I would take a notebook like this and draw a big rectangle indicating the page. And then I would divide it up into panels. Now I only added one panel here because I have no plan and I don't know where I'm going. And the amount of panels is up to you. What I did is I made a horizontal panel. These days, I tend to write 5 panels per page, which for me is not a lot, because I've written comics with 7 or 8 panels per page. It depends on the purpose of the story and the purpose of the panel. In this case, I have an establishing shot. An establishing shot is very important. There has to be an establishing shot on each page. An establishing shot shows all the protagonists in their physical setting in relationship to each other. You don't cut from close-up to close-up. That's no good. If you have a page with all close-ups, it better be all talking heads, and the dialogue had better be brilliant, or else you're just wasting everybody's time. So you start with an establishing shot. In this case, I drew a house in a hilly country, and there are 2 people approaching. Now, obviously, this is not great art, and you wouldn't want to publish this, but it's enough to indicate the idea. I would work a lot harder on these back when I drew each page out by hand, and my art looked like bad amateur art, but it was complete because I studied anatomy a little bit, and I know how to construct a figure, and that's important too, especially if you're doing comics about human beings. Now, a lot of people do manga style or Bigfoot comics, and those don't require the knowledge of human anatomy that a comic book does. So if you can do comics with people and you want it to be accepted, you have to either learn anatomy or hook up with an artist who understands anatomy. As I said, I'm not an artist, I'm a writer, but it's been my honor to work with many great artists over the years. But before I hooked up with those artists, I did study anatomy. And there are two books I'd like to recommend. These are the two best books for drawing anatomy. The first is Figure Drawing for All It's Worth by Andrew Loomis. And the second is Dynamic Anatomy by Bern Hogarth. Now, Bern Hogarth drew the Tarzan Sunday strip for many years. He was a brilliant artist, and his method of constructing the human body is without parallel. And I'll mention a few things that Bern Hogarth taught me. He taught me that in comic books, the heroic figure is 8.5 heads high. What does that mean? It means that you measure the body by the length of the head. Here's the head. It's a half head from the chin to the top of the body. So the neck takes a half head. Then it's 3 heads to the groin and 4 heads to the foot, because the thigh is 2 heads and the calf is 2 heads. Now, in real life, actual human beings are 7.5 heads high. But comics are an art of exaggeration, as we all know. When we look at super muscular Superman or other superpowered beings, and people love to draw those, and people love to see them, especially the male body, because the male body is delineated when the guy's in shape and you're ripped. You can see those muscles standing out in bas relief, and that's what's fun to draw these superhuman figures. And of course, most of them bear no relationship to what real people look like. And a great artist will take that into account. And a great artist can draw real people in regular clothing, and they look real. And there are many comics that did this, like Sandman, Neil Gaiman's comic. Sandman often depicted real people in real clothes, and you would never mistake them for superheroes. On the other hand, you have Batman, Superman, Captain Marvel, and characters like those where their physiology defines their look. Every aspiring comic book artist I know starts out copying comics and trying to draw those super muscular figures. That's a mistake. Do not learn to draw by copying comics. You learn to draw by drawing what you see before you in real life. I think that life drawing, that is when you get somebody to pose for you, nude or clothed, and they remain absolutely still for 15 minutes and you draw that, that's essential. And there are life drawing classes going on all over this country. In every city with a college, there are life drawing classes. All you have to do is look for them, and some of them charge $5 to come in, and that money goes to the model, whoever he or she is. And they're doing that to make a little extra money. And most of these models are pretty physically fit, because you're not going to strip down if you look like a slob. It's worth doing. Every good artist worth his salt carries a notepad with him at all times and a pen, and draws what he sees before him. Be it the furniture, a landscape, a person, a car, or a dog, you have to master all these forms in order to tell a convincing story. Now, that doesn't tell you how to write a comic, and that's another story altogether. And we know many great artists who turn to writing their own material. Some of it is good, some of it is bad. Alex Raymond wrote and illustrated Flash Gordon. Mike Mignola created Hellboy, and he wrote many of those stories. But some artists aren't so great at writing, and some writers aren't so great at drawing. Well, how do you find somebody with whom you can work? One of the best methods is, if you live in a university town, you put up a series of posters. You create a flyer that says, "Writer looking for artist to do serious comic work." And the poster has to give an indication that you're a serious person. So if you have no experience writing, I advise you to start writing today. Every would-be writer has a million words of garbage clogging up his system, and you have to get that out before you get to the good stuff. Writers are people who have to write. They don't talk about it. They don't say they want to do it. They write religiously, often every day. Even though I may not write a chapter for a novel or work on a comic strip every day, I do write every day, and I carry a notepad with me at all times. And every would-be writer also carries a notepad with him at all times and writes down anything that's interesting, be it a story idea or a name that you hear. I can't tell you how often I hear a name that just resonates with me, and I think to myself, I know I'm going to use that. The other day I was looking at a record label, and the artist was thanking his friends who made the record possible. And he said, also thanks to Evil Finkelstein. Evil Finkelstein. Bam, I wrote that down. I know I'm going to use it. Another good source for names is Judge Judy. There's some great names there. But getting back to the art, there are many tricks or skills to creating a comic. And I mentioned that working this way allows you to judge how much weight a story can contain. Now, you see, I've put in the word balloons, and if I were writing this comic, I would put the word balloons in there. Since this is just an example of how I proceed, I don't have the words there. But if I have a caption, it would be like, just so people know where they are. So you give a name to that place, so it seems like a real place. It doesn't have to be a real place. If you're writing a fantasy comic, it could be Queeswalks in the world of Spam or something. And you have to make it convincing. You make it convincing by a combination of art and words. Now, comics are a visual medium. And people often ask me, how do I break into comics? There is no better way to break into comics than to create your own comic. If you go to a convention where there's a big publisher and there are editors, and they're at most major conventions these days, and your comic looks appealing and you give it to an editor, they will read it because they are always on the lookout for talent. But remember, you only get one chance to make a first impression. So don't let anything out of your house unless you're pretty sure that it's a good story with good art. Now, as we all know, comics are a visual medium. You can write a brilliant story, but if it's illustrated like this, nobody's going to read it. I teamed up with Steve Rude and we created Nexus in 1981. Steve Rude, of course, is an internationally acclaimed and brilliant artist. And I could write a recipe book, and if Steve Rude illustrated it, it would sell. And it was all largely on the strength of Steve Rude's art that book was picked up. Of course, once they read the story, they realized that I had created a compelling hero and I knew how to write dialogue, so we were off and running. And that's why practice is important and why it's important to write every day. One of the tricks I've learned is to keep my ears open for fresh idioms, which is the words people use in everyday life, but they have to be fresh, stuff you haven't heard before. And if you ever find and I'll tell you what I mean by that, is you want to avoid cliches at all costs, because comics, in addition to being the most forgiving medium there are a hotbed of cliches. If you ever find yourself writing, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, or move it people, or we have to talk, push yourself back from the keyboard or whatever it is you're writing for, and rethink it. Find a fresh way to say it. There's a rumor, it's an old theory, that there are only 7 plots in fiction. Well, I don't know about that, but for an example, a boy meets girl, they fall in love, boy loses girl, boy gains girl back. Or revenge. Revenge is always a good story. There's an unending appetite for revenge stories, which why they're all over the place. Whenever you get excited about a story and you say, I have a great story, somebody's going to say, what is your story about? And at that point, you have to be prepared. You can't wing it. You can't say, well, it's about a troll fighting some fairies in a far-off land. No. You have to prepare ahead of time by writing down a short and enticing blurb that's designed to interest the reader in the finished product. And you do that by naming your protagonist, giving us just a little background so we know his or her situation, and then going into the story that you've created for them. There's an apocryphal story that Gene Roddenberry sold Star Trek with an elevator pitch, which was Wagon Train in Space. And that's cute, and sometimes that works. I have one myself. I have a novel called Helmet Head, which is about Nazi biker zombies. And for a lot of people, that's enough. Nazi biker zombies, they're there. But for most people, that's not enough. And what you need are a couple of paragraphs, 250 to 500 words. It's a good idea to memorize them. I've memorized them in the past, but of course, now that I'm filming them, I'm drawing a complete blank. Curtis Ball had only two dreams in life, to join the Merchant Marines and to study Kali Eskrima. Now Curtis finds himself managing a warehouse in the Philippines when a couple of tuxedo torpedoes come in one night and demand to examine the contents of a box. Curtis later learns that inside the box is a Chinese dissident who shipped herself out of China to escape after being hunted down for exposing human rights abuses. Now there's a lot more to it than that. And I used to have the whole thing or memorized, but that's the plot of our comic Cue Ball, which I've created with Barry McLean Jr. and will be published next year by Blue Juice Press. So the first step, I think, into creating your comic is to write down what it's about. Now, if you want examples of how to do it, go to Amazon and look at the book descriptions of most popular fiction, especially John D. MacDonald, the Travis McGee novels, or Chuck Logan, the Phil Broker novels. You zero in on one of their novels and there's a description at the head of the page that tells you what the story is about and is just enticing enough to make you say, yeah, that's my kind of story. I want to read more. Now let's get to the visual side of the book again. And you know, I'm jumping all over this place because a lot of you are going to both write and draw your own comics. So we've established that the art has to be attractive or nobody's going to read it. A lot of people don't know how to pace a comic. This is one thing I've learned by drawing the comics by hand. I've mentioned this before. You learn how much weight a page can bear. Now, obviously, you're not going to have 5 panels on every page. A comic has a rhythm and a pulse all its own, which means that the number of panels are going to vary, and sometimes the shape of the panels are going to vary. You don't have to be locked into a series of rectangles. Anybody who's read Jim Steranko or Neil Adams comics knows that you can go free form as long as the story makes sense. But keep in mind that people read from left to right. So you have to tell your story from left to right. Now there are exceptions to this, as there are to every rule. And sometimes you'll have arrows pointing from the right to the left as it moves down the page, as long as it's not moving up the page, because people read left to right down the page. Keep that in mind. Then you want to say, well, I think this scene is worthy of a full page splash, which is devoting the entire page to a single image. In my opinion, this hardly ever happens. The only time you want to use a full page splash is when you reveal something fantastic. And in my opinion, the best thing to reveal in a full page splash is an ancient civilization with a pyramid and a bunch of cities, because then you're looking at something big. When you want to do dialogue, you'll break it down into talking heads. But remember that the comic has to pulse. It opens up, it closes down. It opens up, it closes down. And finally, if you've seen one explosion, you've seen them all. Don't waste a full page splash on an explosion. These are some of the tricks I've learned writing comics over the years, and I hope that you find them useful. Thank you for watching.
Where can people find you?
They can find me on Twitter at Bloody Red Baron. They can find me on Facebook at the comics and novels of Mike Baron. I have a website, bloodyredbaron.com, and I'm Mike Baron on Substack.
Okay, thanks so much.